Flames, smoke, sirens. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the world watched in horror as two planes sliced into the Twin Towers and turned New York's skyline into a nightmare. Thousands of lives were lost in a matter of hours. Millions of people stood frozen in disbelief. America had been attacked in a way no one thought possible. But here's the chilling truth. Someone did see it coming. Long before that morning, when the sky over Manhattan was still clear and calm, one man had been shouting warnings that this exact kind of attack was inevitable. His name was John O'Neill. O'Neill wasn't a random analyst. He was one of the FBI's top counterterrorism experts, a man who had spent his career chasing threats others dismissed. While most of Washington still focused on the Cold War, O'Neill zeroed in on a new enemy, Osama bin Laden. To him, bin Laden wasn't obscure, he was the danger. The mastermind behind bombings in Africa, the shadowy figure directing networks from Afghanistan, the man building an army that didn't need tanks or planes to strike. O'Neill connected the dots early: the embassy attacks in 1998, the USS Cole bombing in 2000, training camps pumping out young recruits, speeches where bin Laden openly promised to bring war to America. O'Neill read every line. He knew these weren't empty threats. Imagine seeing that storm coming. Imagine standing in a room, telling people that a fire is on its way, only to watch them shrug. That's what O'Neill lived every day. He briefed colleagues. He wrote reports. He delivered speeches, always with the same warning: bin Laden is coming for us. Most people smiled politely. Some rolled their eyes. Few took him seriously. Why? Because his truth was inconvenient. To admit O'Neill was right meant shifting budgets, rethinking strategies, challenging the belief that America was safe. Denial was easier. Dismissing him was easier. But O'Neill was relentless. He chased leads across continents. He pressured allies. He argued with bosses. He became obsessed because obsession was the only way to keep the danger in sight. Inside the Bureau, that obsession made him enemies. He was called difficult, arrogant, too intense. In a world of politics and polished careers, O'Neill was raw urgency. He didn't fit the mold. Still, he pushed on. Every clue hardened his conviction. Every missed opportunity deepened his frustration. The writing was on the wall, but no one wanted to read it. Think about that for a moment. The one man screaming about Al-Qaeda was pushed to the sidelines. The very system designed to protect America muted its loudest alarm. And then the day came, September 11th. The planes, the towers, the collapse. Everything O'Neill had feared became reality. But here's the cruel twist. By then, O'Neill wasn't even with the FBI anymore. After years of battles and bureaucratic wars, he had resigned. Tired, shut out, ignored. His new job? Head of security at the World Trade Center, the very place Al-Qaeda had marked for destruction. When the towers fell, O'Neill was inside. The man who had spent his life warning America died in the disaster he predicted. It's haunting. The voice that could have saved thousands was buried beneath the rubble. His story is more than tragedy. It's a lesson in what happens when warnings go unheard. John O'Neill was not wrong. He was not paranoid. He was right. And history proved it in the worst possible way. If you think America was ready to hear him, you're about to see how deep the silence went. Imagine the late 1990s. The Cold War was over. America stood tall as the world's lone superpower. Most people believed the greatest threats were gone. Peace seemed permanent. Safety felt guaranteed. But in the shadows, John O'Neill saw something else. He saw a storm building, and he couldn't stay quiet. Everywhere he looked, the signs were flashing red. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, carried out by a network tied to radical Islamists. Most Americans forgot about it. O'Neill never did. To him, it was proof that terrorists had already marked New York as a target. Then came the embassy bombings in Africa in 1998. Hundreds killed, thousands wounded. The fingerprints of Al-Qaeda all over it. To O'Neill, the message was clear. They were testing America's defenses, pushing closer with every strike. But when he tried to sound the alarm, the reaction was silence. Meetings were cut short. Reports were filed away. Leaders nodded, then moved on to more pressing matters. Why? Because his warnings didn't fit the mood of the times. America wanted prosperity, not paranoia. Wall Street was booming. Technology was exploding. People wanted to believe the threats were distant, far away, not here at home. So when O'Neill spoke about bin Laden, it felt like noise in the background. Inconvenient, unwelcome. His obsession with terrorism clashed with the optimism of the era. Inside the FBI, he was respected for his intelligence, but he was also seen as abrasive. Too blunt, too intense. He didn't play politics. He wasn't interested in climbing quietly up the ladder. He wanted results. That made him dangerous not to terrorists, but to bureaucrats. Still, he refused to shut up. He built task forces. He tracked money trails. He pushed to connect cases others treated as isolated events. Again and again he warned, "This is bigger than you think. They're coming here." But here's the cruel truth. Nobody wanted to believe him, because belief would require action. And action meant changing everything. More resources, more focus, more urgency. The system wasn't built for that. It was built for comfort, routine, and paperwork. Imagine the frustration. You see the train coming. You shout at the passengers to move. They laugh. They wave you off. And then they go back to their coffee. That's what John O'Neill lived every day. Some even mocked him, called him obsessed, said he was chasing ghosts. But O'Neill knew better. He had met the men behind these plots. He had traced their networks. He had seen the growing ambition. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing the future. And that future arrived on September 11th, 2001. The very thing O'Neill had warned about unfolded live on television. Planes hijacked, towers burning, lives lost. The nightmare he tried to stop became reality. But here's the most painful part. His warnings weren't vague. They weren't abstract. He said planes could be used as weapons. He said the Twin Towers were a target. He said Al-Qaeda was preparing for something massive. He spelled it out. And still the nation turned the page. Leaders looked the other way. His voice was drowned out by convenience and denial. That's why John O'Neill's story matters. It's not just about one man being ignored. It's about what happens when a country chooses comfort over truth. It's about how arrogance and complacency can be more dangerous than any enemy. Because the warning was there. Loud, clear, repeated. And still, nobody wanted to hear it. And as the clock ticked toward September 11th, O'Neill realized something chilling. If the system wouldn't listen, the disaster was inevitable. Why was John O'Neill so relentless? Why did he refuse to stay quiet when everyone else wanted to move on? Because he saw something others refused to see. The rise of a man named Osama bin Laden. Through the 1990s, bin Laden was no household name. To most Americans, he was just another foreign extremist, a figure on the evening news with no direct connection to their lives. But to O'Neill, bin Laden was a storm gathering strength. He studied the patterns, the operations, the ideology. He understood that this was not just another terrorist. This was a man with a global vision, and America was his ultimate target. The evidence was already there. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded beneath the World Trade Center. The plan had been simple but devastating. Topple one tower into the other. The attack failed to achieve its full purpose, but to O'Neill, it was a warning shot. He saw the intent. He saw the ambition. He knew they would try again. Then came 1998. U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania reduced to rubble, hundreds killed, thousands wounded. Al-Qaeda had made its presence undeniable. To O'Neill, it was no longer a question of if but when. But to policymakers, it was still someone else's problem. Far away. Contained. Not urgent. In October 2000, the USS Cole was attacked in Yemen. A small boat. A suicide mission. 17 sailors dead. Once again, O'Neill was there, investigating, connecting the dots. And once again, he ran headfirst into resistance. Reports were delayed, leads buried, warnings softened. Each time, the urgency in his voice grew sharper. Each time, the system pushed back harder. O'Neill didn't see bin Laden as a distant threat. He saw him as the most dangerous enemy America had ever faced. A man willing to spend years planning, willing to die for his cause, and most terrifying of all, willing to teach others to do the same. O'Neill saw Al-Qaeda not as an organization, but as a movement, a network without borders, a fire spreading under the surface while the world kept looking elsewhere. And this was O'Neill's torment. Every new attack, every new clue, only deepened his conviction. But the louder he shouted, the more he was dismissed as alarmist, obsessive, or difficult to work with. To him, bin Laden was the storm. To everyone else, he was still a shadow. That gap between what O'Neill saw and what the rest of America chose to believe would define the years leading up to 9/11. Because while O'Neill was tracing the rise of a terrorist threat, the institutions around him were blind to it. And that blindness takes us directly into the next chapter of this story, the intelligence failures that allowed the storm to build unnoticed. John O'Neill could see the threat. He mapped it out with precision. The problem wasn't what he saw. The problem was what everyone else refused to see. America's intelligence world was a maze. The FBI had its walls. The CIA had its walls. Information didn't flow freely. It got trapped, controlled, hoarded. And in those gaps, Al-Qaeda grew stronger. O'Neill's job inside the FBI was counterterrorism. He hunted down networks. He chased leads across continents. He lived for the chase, but time after time, he found himself hitting a wall, not built by terrorists, but by his own government. Take the relationship between the FBI and the CIA. On paper, they were allies. In practice, they were rivals. Each guarded its information like treasure. Each feared giving the other too much power. So when crucial intelligence surfaced, a name, a phone call, a piece of travel data, it often stayed locked away. Pieces of a puzzle scattered across agencies, never assembled into a full picture. And this wasn't just bureaucracy. It was deadly. In 2000 and 2001, the CIA tracked men linked to Al-Qaeda, attending secret meetings in Asia. They had names, they had faces, they even knew some had US visas, but that information didn't reach the FBI in time. O'Neill never saw it. And those men, they later boarded planes on September 11th. Imagine O'Neill's frustration. He was chasing bin Laden with everything he had, and yet the most vital pieces of the puzzle were being kept from him. Not by the enemy, by his own side. This blind spot was systemic. The FBI was built for crime after the fact. Bank robberies, murders, investigation. They weren't built to stop foreign terror before it struck. Prevention required coordination, flexibility, and imagination. But the machine wasn't built that way. It was built for paperwork, built for silos, built for routine. And here's where O'Neill clashed hardest. He wasn't a man of routine. He pushed. He demanded urgency. He asked uncomfortable questions, and in a system allergic to disruption, that made him an outsider. The very qualities that made him effective against terrorists made him unwanted inside the bureaucracy. So the blind spot grew wider. Al-Qaeda's name surfaced in scattered memos, travel patterns, raised alarms. Threat reports mentioned hijackings. Yet no one stitched it together. To the system, each warning looked small. To O'Neill, they were giant arrows pointing in the same direction. But he was one voice. And one voice, inside a machine built to resist, was never enough. This is the tragedy. The blind spot wasn't just ignorance. It was willful. Leaders believed they had time. They believed America was too strong, too distant, too untouchable. They didn't want to imagine airplanes turned into missiles. They didn't want to imagine skyscrapers collapsing. They didn't want to imagine war reaching American soil. So the intelligence was there, the warnings were there, the man ready to act was there. And still the blind spot held. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a failure of imagination, a refusal to connect the dots, staring them in the face, a system more concerned with protecting its turf than protecting its people. And John O'Neill, the man who saw it all, could only watch in rage as opportunity after opportunity slipped away. But this story doesn't stop at blind spot. Because what crushed O'Neill more than anything wasn't just the missed clues. It was the bureaucracy that punished bravery, silenced urgency, and slowed every step toward action. That's where we go next. John O'Neill didn't lose to terrorists. He lost to paperwork, to politics, to the grinding weight of bureaucracy. Inside the FBI, he wasn't praised for urgency. He was punished for it. Colleagues respected his talent, but leaders saw him as a problem. Too loud, too passionate, too unwilling to play by the rules of hierarchy. O'Neill wanted speed. The system wanted meetings. He wanted answers. The system wanted reports. He wanted prevention. The system wanted deniability. Every time he pushed harder, the pushback grew stronger. He knew bin Laden was plotting something monumental. But instead of rallying around him, his own agency treated him like a liability. He wasn't advancing his career. He was endangering it. And bureaucracy didn't just slow him down. It actively sabotaged him. Leads were delayed, approvals withheld, resources misallocated. O'Neill would chase suspects overseas only to find his funding cut, his team limited, his hands tied by red tape. It was like fighting a fire with a glass of water. Not because there wasn't a hose, but because someone refused to turn it on. Even when attacks screamed for urgent focus, the bureaucracy found ways to drown urgency in silence. After the USS Cole bombing in 2000, O'Neill went to Yemen to investigate. He worked the case with ferocious dedication, but he clashed with ambassadors and officials who valued diplomacy over truth. They feared his directness. They saw him as disruptive. Instead of backing his investigation, they pulled him back, stripped his authority, sent him home. Think about that. 17 American sailors, murdered, a terrorist network gaining momentum. And the man most determined to stop them was sidelined, not by the enemy, but by his own country's system. And it wasn't just the FBI, it was the larger culture of Washington. A culture where career survival mattered more than national survival, where protecting reputations mattered more than protecting lives, where the appearance of stability was valued over the reality of danger. O'Neill embodied the opposite. He was brash, yes, impatient, yes, but those traits came from urgency, from seeing the clock ticking down. He didn't care about smoothing egos, he cared about stopping the next attack. But in a system addicted to comfort, that bravery was interpreted as recklessness. And so the very man America needed most became the man the bureaucracy wanted least. And here lies the cruel paradox. Bureaucracy should serve bravery. It should empower it. It should amplify it. Instead, it crushed it. It silenced it. It buried it under layers of paper, protocol and politics, until the fire O'Neill was pointing to was already out of control. This wasn't just frustrating for him, it was devastating. He knew the threat was real. He knew time was running out. But instead of being unleashed to act, he was caged by the very system designed to defend the nation. And the result of that cage would soon become catastrophic. Because while the bureaucracy stalled, the terrorists moved. While America filed memos, Al-Qaeda wrote plans. While O'Neill was sidelined, the enemy was sharpening the blade. And the worst part, the clues were already there. Clues that, if followed, might have changed everything. That's where we go next. By the year 2001, the puzzle pieces were scattered across desks in Washington. Each piece carried weight. Each piece carried urgency. But no one put them together. The warnings weren't vague. They weren't hidden. They were sitting in plain sight. Agents flagged strange activity at flight schools. Foreign students with little interest in learning to land, but obsessed with how to steer large planes in the air. To most it seemed odd but harmless. To O'Neill it would have screamed danger, but he never saw those reports. They never made it to his desk. Then there were the cables from the CIA about two men tied to Al-Qaeda attending meetings in Malaysia. The agency even knew they held visas for the United States. These men weren't just whispers on paper. They were names, faces, walking threats. And still, the information was bottled up. The FBI, O'Neill's team, never got the memo in time. Those same men later boarded American Airlines Flight 77 and slammed it into the Pentagon. There was more. Intercepts mentioning bin Laden's determination to strike inside America. A memo titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." reaching the White House in August 2001. Warnings about hijackings. Warnings about catastrophic attacks. All there. All ignored. And O'Neill, he was no longer inside the FBI to fight for action. Months earlier, pushed out by politics and frustration, he'd left the Bureau behind. The voice that had shouted for years had been silenced just when it was needed most. The missed clues weren't just mistakes. They were symptoms of a system that couldn't imagine the unthinkable. Airplanes as weapons, too far-fetched. Terrorists inside America, too unlikely. Towers collapsing, impossible. So the pieces sat untouched. The puzzle stayed incomplete. But hindsight is cruel. Looking back, the path seems obvious. Put those flight school reports together with the visa warnings. Add the intercepted chatter. Layer in the embassy bombings, the USS Cole, the growing boldness of Al-Qaeda. The picture sharpens instantly. The threat becomes undeniable. If O'Neill had been empowered instead of sidelined, would he have connected those dots? Almost certainly. He had been doing it for years, long before anyone else cared. But by the summer of 2001, his hands were tied, his access cut, his influence erased. And here's the haunting truth. History isn't just shaped by what we see, it's shaped by what we refuse to see. And in the summer of 2001, America refused to see the storm already forming overhead. The clues were there. The warnings were there. The man who understood them was there, but none of it was enough. And when history finally caught up, it was merciless. But before that day of reckoning, we need to step back to understand not just the warnings, but the man himself. Because John O'Neill wasn't just an FBI agent. He was a complex, flawed, and deeply human figure. And his story makes this tragedy cut even deeper. That's where we go next. Who was John O'Neill, really? To understand the tragedy of his story, you have to see the man behind the warnings. He wasn't some faceless bureaucrat. He was larger than life, charismatic, intense, the kind of man who could command a room with his presence. Colleagues described him as both brilliant and difficult, inspiring and infuriating. He lived fast. He worked harder. He chased danger, and he chased life with the same fire. O'Neill dressed sharp, loved fine cigars and enjoyed the spotlight. He wasn't afraid to make waves. In a culture of grey suits and quiet caution, he stood out. Some admired him for it, others resented him, but no one ignored him. What drove him wasn't ego alone. It was obsession. Terrorism wasn't just his job. It was his mission. He studied it. He tracked it. He lived it. When others clocked out, O'Neill kept digging. When others moved on, O'Neill doubled down. He knew Al-Qaeda like no one else in America, and that made him both invaluable and threatening. But O'Neill wasn't perfect. His intensity came at a cost. He pushed people too hard. He clashed with superiors. He demanded more than the system was willing to give. His personal life was messy, filled with affairs and complications. He was a man constantly at war. Not just with terrorists, but with himself. And yet, those flaws made him real. He wasn't a myth or a symbol. He was human. A man whose strengths and weaknesses were bound together, fueling his drive to protect a country that wouldn't listen. That drive sometimes looked reckless. But it came from urgency, from knowing time was running out. O'Neill didn't care about smoothing politics. He cared about stopping the next attack. He was the rare kind of leader who didn't just see the future coming. He tried to drag others toward it, even if they resisted. His colleagues may have called him abrasive, but many also admitted he was usually right. And that's the tragedy. The very traits that made him effective against Al-Qaeda made him unwelcome inside the FBI. His brilliance was inseparable from his flaws, his urgency was inseparable from his downfall, and in the end, it was those flaws that the bureaucracy used against him. Instead of empowering him, they isolated him. Instead of trusting him, they questioned him. Instead of following his warnings, they shut the door. John O'Neill wasn't a saint. He wasn't a villain. He was something far more haunting. A man who saw disaster before it happened, but couldn't stop it because of the walls around him. And those walls didn't just silence him. They left America unprepared. Because while O'Neill was fighting his personal battles, the country was about to face its greatest test. The real question was never just about him. It was about all of us. Was America ready to hear the truth? The answer, tragically, was no. And that takes us into the next chapter. Why America, even with all the clues, wasn't ready to face what was coming. America in the 1990s felt untouchable. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The biggest enemy the nation had faced for nearly half a century was gone, and victory felt permanent. The United States stood as the only superpower, unmatched in wealth, technology, and military might. To most people, terrorism was something distant, something that happened in the Middle East, not in the heart of New York City. And that was the problem. America wasn't ready, because America didn't want to believe. Politicians were focused on other battles. Domestic debates about healthcare, budgets, and scandals consumed Washington. Globalization and technology fueled optimism. The stock market soared. The internet was being born. A future of prosperity seemed inevitable. Who wanted to hear about shadowy men hiding in caves, plotting a war that no one else could see? For ordinary citizens, the idea of a catastrophic terrorist attack felt impossible. Sure, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing had happened, but it had faded quickly from public memory. A truck filled with explosives had killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000. Yet the towers still stood. Life went on. People convinced themselves it had been a fluke, a failed attempt, not a warning of what was to come. Even inside the intelligence community, the mindset was fixed on old enemies. Agencies like the FBI and CIA had been built to fight the Cold War. They excelled at chasing spies, countering communism, and protecting secrets. Terrorism, that was considered small-scale, a law enforcement issue, not a national security crisis. Al-Qaeda didn't fit into the old categories. It wasn't a nation. It wasn't an army. It was an idea, scattered across borders, growing quietly in the shadows. And because it didn't look like past threats, the system underestimated it. This blindness wasn't just strategic. It was cultural. America trusted its oceans, its power, and its dominance. The thought that 19 men with box cutters could cripple the nation was unthinkable. The more O'Neill shouted, the more people saw him as alarmist. Fear wasn't welcome in the booming 1990s. Optimism was, and optimism can be deadly. O'Neill tried to pierce that illusion. He warned that Al-Qaeda wasn't just planning attacks overseas. They wanted to hit the United States itself. He spoke of airplanes. He spoke of symbolic targets. He told anyone who would listen that it was only a matter of time. But instead of preparing, leaders hesitated. Instead of mobilizing, they doubted. They didn't want to believe that the peace they felt was a fragile illusion. Part of the reason was comfort. Preparing for terrorism would mean rethinking airports, borders, and intelligence sharing. It would mean spending money and political capital on a threat most voters didn't yet care about. It was easier to delay, easier to push the warnings aside, easier to tell themselves that O'Neill was exaggerating. But denial has a cost. The more the system ignored him, the more vulnerable America became, and the more frustrated O'Neill grew, the harder he pushed. His urgency clashed with their complacency. His vision clashed with their blindness. Imagine being him, seeing the storm on the horizon, while everyone else insists the skies are clear, watching time run out, while the people with power refuse to move. That was John O'Neill's reality. He wasn't just fighting terrorists. He was fighting disbelief, and that disbelief shaped America's fate. When the towers finally fell, people said it was unimaginable. But for O'Neill, it wasn't unimaginable at all. It was inevitable. He had seen it coming for years. America wasn't ready because it chose not to be. Not because the warnings weren't there, but because listening would have meant changing, sacrificing comfort, and facing a darker reality. That unwillingness to listen didn't just silence John O'Neill. It set the stage for disaster. And the price of that silence would be measured in lives, in fire, and in ash. But the story doesn't stop there, because the cost of ignoring those warnings wasn't abstract. It played out in real time, in the final months of O'Neill's life, when his career collided with the very forces he had been trying to stop. By the late 1990s, John O'Neill was no longer just warning about Al-Qaeda. He was shouting into the void. He told anyone who would listen that America was a target, that Osama bin Laden was planning something devastating. But each time, the system shrugged, and every time the system shrugged, the cost grew. The missed clues weren't small. They were massive. In 1998, Al-Qaeda bombed US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing more than 200 people. O'Neill saw the pattern. These weren't isolated attacks. They were steps in a larger plan. Still, Washington treated them like distant tragedies, not warnings of a storm headed directly for America. In 2000, the USS Cole was attacked in Yemen. 17 American sailors were killed. The explosion tore through the ship, a reminder that Al-Qaeda was striking wherever it could. For O'Neill, this was proof. The threat was growing, not fading. But again, the response was muted. Investigations dragged. Bureaucracy stalled. Leaders debated while the enemy plotted. Each attack should have been a wake-up call. Instead, they became footnotes, and O'Neill's voice became easier to dismiss. Inside the FBI, he grew restless. His passion, his obsession, his refusal to back down, all of it made him a target inside his own agency. He clashed with superiors. He pushed too hard. His warnings were treated as exaggerations. To many, he was becoming more trouble than he was worth. And here lies the cruel irony. The very man who may have been the closest to stopping 9/11 was being pushed out. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right too soon, and too loudly. By 2001, O'Neill's career with the FBI was collapsing. After years of service, he resigned, frustrated, bitter, and out of options. The system had silenced him, not with arguments but with indifference. And in the silence, Al-Qaeda prepared the deadliest attack on American soil. But here's where the story twists into tragedy. After leaving the FBI, O'Neill took a new job. He became head of security at the World Trade Center. The very place he had warned would be a target was now under his protection. It was as if fate had written him into the story, binding him to the towers he had long feared would fall. Think about that for a moment. The man who spent years trying to stop an attack ended up standing at ground zero when it happened. The warnings he had screamed into the void became his own fate. That's not just irony. That's tragedy in its purest form. The cost of ignoring him wasn't just national. It was personal. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, John O'Neill reported to work like any other day. When the first plane struck, chaos erupted. As people fled, he moved toward the danger, trying to help, trying to lead, trying to protect the very lives he had dedicated his career to saving. He never made it out. O'Neill died inside the Twin Towers, the same towers he had warned about for years. His body was found in the rubble days later. The system had ignored him. The nation had overlooked him. And in the end, he paid with his life. The cost of ignoring warnings isn't abstract. It isn't theoretical. It's human. It's the thousands who died that day. It's the families shattered. It's the firefighters, the office workers, the police officers, the ordinary people who jumped, ran, or were buried beneath steel and ash. John O'Neill's death wasn't just another casualty of 9/11. It was the embodiment of everything he had fought against. His voice, silenced in life, became deafening in death. And this is where the story turns from tragedy to reckoning. Because September 11th wasn't just an attack. It was the moment America had to face the truth it had long denied. The warnings were real, the threat was real, and the price of not listening was written in fire across the sky. Which brings us to the day itself, the morning the world changed forever. The day the sky fell, September 11th, 2001. It began like any other Tuesday. The sky over Manhattan was crisp, blue, flawless. New Yorkers rushed through crowded sidewalks, coffee in hand, briefcases clutched tight, the hum of a city alive. Nobody knew the morning would end in fire. Nobody knew the skyline itself was about to be scarred forever. At 8:46 a.m., everything changed. American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. For a moment, people thought it was an accident, a plane off course, a tragic mistake. Smoke billowed from the upper floors, black against the perfect blue. Sirens wailed. Crowds gathered below, staring upward in shock. Then, at 9:03 a.m., the second plane hit. United Airlines Flight 175 tore into the South Tower with a fireball so massive it stunned even the most seasoned first responders. The illusion of accident shattered. This wasn't a mistake. This was war, carried out in broad daylight against the heart of America's largest city. The towers, symbols of power and progress, now burned like torches. Inside, chaos reigned. Thousands of office workers were trapped above the impact zones, stairwells filled with smoke, elevators froze. People clung to hope that rescue was coming. Others faced impossible choices. Some called loved ones to say goodbye. Others jumped, desperate to escape the flames. Those images, bodies falling against steel and sky, remain among the most haunting of that day. But the horror wasn't over. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, ripping a hole in the headquarters of America's military might. And at 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, its passengers fighting back after learning of the other hijackings, plummeted into a field in Pennsylvania. Their courage likely saved the U.S. Capitol from becoming the next target. Back in New York, the towers burned like wounded giants. Firefighters, police, and rescuers rushed inside, climbing toward danger as others fled down. They carried hoses, axes, stretchers, and unshakable determination. Many knew they might not come out. Still they went. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. The ground shook. A wave of dust and debris swallowed lower Manhattan. People ran as a choking gray cloud rolled through the streets, blotting out the sun. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. In just 102 minutes, both skyscrapers that defined New York's skyline had been reduced to smoldering ruins. The unthinkable had happened. John O'Neill was inside. The man who had warned about this very moment was now trapped in the nightmare he had tried to prevent. As the towers fell, so too did his life's work. He had spent years saying the words nobody wanted to hear. On that morning, those words turned into reality, burying him beneath the rubble. Across the city, across the nation, disbelief turned into grief. Phones stopped working. Families frantically searched for loved ones. News anchors, usually calm and composed, broke into tears on live television. The Pentagon burned. Manhattan bled. America staggered. By the end of the day, nearly 3,000 people were dead. Thousands more were injured. And millions around the world watched in horror as the most powerful nation on earth realized it was not untouchable. The day the sky fell was not just about buildings collapsing. It was about certainty collapsing, safety collapsing, illusions collapsing. For decades, America had believed its battles were fought elsewhere, in deserts, jungles, and distant lands. On September 11th, the war came home, and with the smoke still rising, the question loomed, how could this have happened? How could the warnings have been missed? How could the man who saw it coming end up dying in the very towers he said would fall? The answers lie not just in intelligence failures or missed signals, but in something deeper, a nation that wasn't ready to listen. Because September 11th wasn't just the day the towers fell. It was the day America had to face the cost of silence, denial, and delay. The ash had barely settled. The fires still burned. Yet even then, one truth became undeniable. This tragedy was not born in a single morning. It was born in the years of warnings ignored, voices dismissed, and dangers minimized. And that is why the story of John O'Neill matters, because his life and his death remind us that ignoring the truth doesn't make it go away. It only makes the cost greater when it finally arrives. The next question is the hardest one of all. What lessons did America actually learn? The morning after September 11th, New York was unrecognizable. The proud skyline was gone, replaced by smoking ruins. A blanket of ash covered the streets. Cars sat abandoned, coated gray. Flyers with photos of missing loved ones papered every wall, every lamppost, every subway entrance. The city that never slept had fallen silent. But amid the silence came a question that refused to fade. How did this happen? Politicians spoke of shock. Journalists spoke of surprise. But for those who knew John O'Neill's story, there was no surprise. There was heartbreak, because everything he warned about had come true, and it was now written in fire and rubble for the world to see. The first lesson was brutally clear. America had underestimated its enemies. For years, Osama bin Laden had been treated as just another name in a faraway desert, a nuisance, not a threat. Yet with box cutters and determination, 19 men reshaped the course of history. They didn't need armies, they didn't need tanks. They weaponized America's own airplanes and turned them into missiles. O'Neill had tried to explain this shift. He had said, "This is not a small fight, this is the future." But the future arrived before anyone wanted to believe it. The second lesson was about bureaucracy. Agencies hoarded information instead of sharing it. The FBI knew pieces, the CIA knew pieces. Local authorities had fragments, but nobody put them together in time. That wall of silence, the same wall O'Neill spent his career trying to break, stood firm, and thousands paid the price. In the ashes of Ground Zero, it became impossible to deny secrecy had killed as much as terror. The third lesson was about vulnerability. For decades, America believed oceans were its shield. Wars happened over there, but the rubble in New York and the crater in the Pentagon proved otherwise. Distance no longer protected. The enemy had found a way in, and once they had, the destruction was instant. O'Neill knew this. He had seen the early attacks on American embassies, the USS Cole, the signs pointing towards something bigger. Yet each time, his urgency was dismissed as exaggeration. On 9/11, exaggeration became reality. The fourth lesson was harder, more personal. Leadership isn't about popularity. It's about facing truths no one wants to face. O'Neill embodied that. He didn't soften his message. He didn't downplay the threat. He told people what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. And for that, he was sidelined. In the ruins of the towers, America learned what happens when truth-tellers are ignored. But even in devastation, hope emerged. Firefighters dug through mountains of steel, refusing to give up. Volunteers lined the streets, handing out water, masks, and food. Blood banks overflowed with donors. Across the nation, flags were raised, hymns were sung, strangers held each other and wept together. The terrorists had struck to divide. But in those first raw weeks, America pulled closer than it had in generations. Still, unity doesn't erase responsibility. As the dust settled, investigations began. Questions were asked in Congress. Reports were written. The 9/11 Commission was formed. Page after page revealed what O'Neill had been saying all along. The signs were there. The dots could have been connected. But they weren't, and so the lessons carved into ash were not just about terrorism. They were about listening, about humility, about the danger of thinking It can't happen here. History doesn't forgive denial, it punishes it, and on September 11th, the punishment was merciless. John O'Neill didn't live to see those lessons written in official reports. He didn't live to hear leaders admit what he had tried to scream into the halls of power. But his life made one truth, undeniable: ignoring the uncomfortable is never safety. It is a gamble, and when the gamble fails, the cost is measured in lives. The towers had fallen. The city mourned. The world watched. And America, for the first time in a generation, was forced to ask itself, what now? The answer would shape wars, policies, and generations to come. But the deeper question, the one John O'Neill's story forces us to confront, is whether we truly learned. Because lessons written in ash fade quickly if we don't hold on to them. And that leads us to the most haunting question of all. Can we ever truly listen? The rubble of 9/11s didn't just bury lives, it buried illusion. For years, America believed it was immune, untouchable, shielded by power and distance. John O'Neill tried to tell a different story. He tried to warn that the shield was already cracked. But his voice was drowned out by bureaucracy, politics, and pride. The question that haunts us is simple, yet brutal. Can we ever truly listen to warnings before it's too late? History suggests we struggle. Warnings rarely arrive gift-wrapped. They come in fragments, whispers, scattered dots that only a few can see. O'Neill saw them. He pieced together embassy bombings, terror cells, intelligence leaks, and Osama bin Laden's declarations. To him, it was a flashing red alarm. To others, it was noise, easy to dismiss, easier to delay. And so the warnings piled up, unanswered, until the towers burned. But it isn't just government, it's human nature. We cling to comfort. We prefer the story that says everything is fine over the one that says danger is near. Listening requires sacrifice. It requires admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability is uncomfortable. Nations avoid it, leaders avoid it, even ordinary people avoid it. That avoidance, multiplied across an entire system, can become deadly. Think about it. How many tragedies, from wars to pandemics to financial collapses, carry the same pattern? Someone always raises a hand early. Someone always points to the danger, and almost always that person is ignored until disaster proves them right. O'Neill's story isn't just about terrorism. It's about this universal blindness. Our resistance to hearing what we don't want to hear. And yet, listening isn't weakness. It is strength. It's what prevents small sparks from becoming infernos. Imagine if O'Neill's warnings had been taken seriously. Imagine if intelligence agencies had shared data instead of hoarding it. Imagine if the culture valued action over denial. The morning of 9/11 might have been another ordinary Tuesday. Thousands of lives might have been spared. The world might have been spared decades of war. But imagining isn't enough. The real challenge is learning. Can we build systems that value the inconvenient truth more than the comfortable lie? Can leaders embrace the unpopular messenger instead of silencing them? Can societies reward foresight instead of hindsight? These questions matter not just for America, but for every nation, every community, every family. John O'Neill's life gives us a map. He wasn't perfect. He was brash, stubborn, relentless. But those very qualities allowed him to see danger others missed. He represents the voices we need to protect, the ones willing to say what no one else will. Ignoring them is not just a mistake. It is an invitation for disaster. So, can we truly listen? The answer depends on whether we are willing to change how we see warning itself. Not as annoyance, not as paranoia, but as a gift, a chance to act before it's too late. Listening requires courage. The courage to confront fear before it becomes reality. The courage to admit that comfort is temporary, but truth is permanent. And maybe that's the deepest lesson of 9/11. The attacks were not just about terrorism. They were about silence. Silence in the face of truth. Silence in the halls of power. Silence that cost nearly 3,000 lives in a single morning. If we honor those lives, It cannot only be with memorials, ceremonies, or moments of silence. It must also be with a promise. The next time someone like John O'Neill raises their voice, we will not turn away, we will listen. Because history has a cruel way of repeating itself, and every ignored warning carries the potential for another morning of flames, smoke, and sirens. The story of John O'Neill ends in the ruins of the World Trade Center, but the story of what we do with his warning, that story is still being written. And it brings us to the final question. After everything we've lost, after everything we've learned, what do we do now? John O'Neill's story doesn't end with the collapse of the towers. It doesn't even end with the thousands of lives lost that day. His story lingers because it forces us to face a truth we would rather avoid: the cost of not listening. O'Neill spent his career chasing shadows others dismissed. He warned that Osama bin Laden wasn't just a distant extremist, but a man building an army with global reach. He spoke about airplanes being turned into weapons when others laughed at the idea. He fought against the walls of secrecy inside the intelligence community, begging for cooperation that never came. And when he was silenced, when his warnings were shelved, history punished the silence with fire and ash. That is the final warning. Warnings ignored do not disappear. They wait, they grow. And when they finally arrive, they arrive with a cost far greater than the price of prevention. Look at the decades since 9/11. Entire wars were fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. Trillions of dollars spent, thousands more lives lost. Generations scarred by the fight against terrorism. The world reshaped by fear and suspicion. Airports turned into fortresses. Surveillance expanded into daily life. Civil liberties debated and redefined. This is the cost of reacting too late, the price of waiting until tragedy forces our hand. O'Neill didn't live to see the wars, the debates, the changes. He didn't live to see his name appear in commission reports or documentaries. He died inside the very building he had once said was vulnerable. But maybe that is what makes his story so haunting. He became a symbol of the truth ignored, a man buried not only by steel and concrete, but by denial. And so his life leaves us with a challenge. Will we repeat the same mistake? Will we continue to silence voices that bring uncomfortable truths? Or will we finally recognize that the messenger is not the enemy? Ignorance is. The final warning is not about terrorism alone. It's about every crisis waiting in the wings. Climate change, pandemics, economic collapse, cyber warfare, each has its own John O'Neill somewhere, trying to be heard, pointing to the danger on the horizon. The question is whether we are willing to listen before the sky falls again. Because here's the hardest part. Listening doesn't feel urgent. It feels inconvenient. It feels costly. But ignoring is always costlier. The ash of ground zero is proof. So what do we do now? We remember not just the lives lost in the towers, the Pentagon, and that Pennsylvania field, but the man who tried to prevent it. We honor not just the firefighters and first responders, but also the voices like O'Neill's, who gave everything to pull truth into the light. We decide today to build a culture that values warning more than comfort, that values prevention more than denial, that values truth more than pride. History is not just written in victories, it is written in mistakes. The greatest tragedy of John O'Neill's life is not that he died on 9/11. It's that he died proving himself right. And if we allow his story to fade, if we let his warnings be forgotten, then we risk repeating the same cycle. Ignorance, denial, disaster. That is the true cost of forgetting. The towers may have fallen, but the choice is still standing before us. To listen or not to listen, to act or to wait, to face the truth or to hide from it. John O'Neill gave his life trying to answer that question for us. Now it is ours to answer, and the next time the warning comes, the world will know if we learned, or if we did. This was the story of John O'Neill, the man who tried to warn America before 9/11, a story of truth ignored, and the price we all paid. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more powerful untold histories, because the past still speaks to us, and here we make sure it's never forgotten.